All right. Thanks for coming today, everybody. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Erica Cochran. She's an assistant professor and doctor of professional practice in the Architecture, Engineering, and Construction Management program. Is that right? And is the director of the U-Dream program at Carnegie Mellon University. She has over 20 years of experience developing technical design solutions to create sustainable, healthy, and energy-efficient commercial buildings. Today she's going to give us her presentation, Beyond Energy Efficiency, How Big Data Can Lead to Socially Responsible Design.
Thank you. So of course I just took a bite, so ha ha ha. All right, can you hear me? Yes? All right. So they asked me to first tell you a little bit about myself. All right, I'm going to go over here. So this is me. And I thought if I'm going to tell about myself, I should show all the places I've lived. And I'm pretty much an East Coast mutt. That's what I like to call myself. People say, where are you from? I'm like, I'm an East Coast mutt. And so those are all places, up here that I've lived. And yeah, there we go. And then, so I'm, from Brooklyn, if there's any New York people here, Brooklyn. And then went to Virginia Tech, went to CMU, and I just couldn't leave for some reason. And so then I just decided to hang out with them for, a few years. All right, so I'm going to run through these really quick because it's kind of how I got here. So I always wanted to be an architect. I played with Legos. Like, Legos are fun, building's fun. And what else do you do if math is easy and you like playing Legos? Is you become an architect, right? It's like, well, I guess that's what I'm going to do for a living. So these are just some projects I've worked on. So I was doing all these fun projects, and I was like, wow, this is so cool. People pay me to draw and build stuff. I'm having so much fun. This is great. And they actually pay me for this. I would work on new projects. New York has a lot of old buildings. And so this was an old movie theater, and that, obviously came into disrepair. When we restored it and turned it into a church. So it went from that to that, and it went from those earlier pictures, now it looks like this. So I thought, so again, I'm thinking, this is so much fun. One funny story about the church, this is Brooklyn Tabernacle Church. They've won a number of gospel Grammys, so that's how they were able to pay for all this. And if you've ever gone to a church where you have like 2,500 people singing gospel, what happened is that the balcony started to sway. So because they were singing gospel and they're doing like this, and then the balcony would sway. And so we actually had to have our structural engineers go to church and put sensors in to make sure that the swaying was okay. So it's okay. But I thought that was pretty cool and something they never taught me in school to worry about. So if you do something in this gospel music and everyone sways at the same time, you may feel a rocking. How do you teach that in school? So then the other part is I was doing a lot of schools, and I'm starting to see schools that look like this. This is, awful. And I'm going, this is bad. Water's running down the stairs. This is is a classroom, and I'm going, this is not good. Your energy bills are high because your insulation's gone, because there's a hole in your wall. And if you want to know why, and then I kept thinking, this isn't good, and I was seeing a difference in wealth. I was like, people had all these beautiful places, and then I'd go into some other communities, and I'd go, really? And you expect these kids to still be straight A's and go to Carnegie Mellon and Virginia Tech and UC Davis? No. And so that got me thinking, so I started doing lead and reading more, and then I had a great idea. I should go back to school and get a PhD and study this. And so that's how I ended up in school. It was basically, I was working and I was doing fun stuff, and I saw differences in how people were treated, and I thought that architecture had an impact on that. And so I wanted to study it more, and so I, talked to my boyfriend, now husband, and I'm like, yes, I'm going to quit my job, and I'm going to need you to support me. And I'm going to do this. And we're going to be long distance, but it'll be cool. So it worked out, because we are married, and we have a 9-month-old at home. So, yay! So, of course, what happens when I graduate is all the things that I research are still the things that I deeply care about. So I still do a lot of research on schools. I love to talk, so anything where I get to talk and work with people, because I just love people, that's cool. I've gotten to go to the White House a couple of times because of some of the stuff I'm working on, so that's always fun. Never saw Obama. Darn. Now don't really want to go. And then also, just trying to track energy. And I think that's because my dad was always like, close the door, we're not trying to heat all of Brooklyn. And so, he was always doing these retrofit things, but they weren't scientific. Like, he'd get plastic and a staple gun and be like, there, I've insulated the house. And so, I'm like, I wonder if there's a better way. And so that leads me to where I am today. So, big data, what is it? This is what we're going to talk about. Yay. So the first thing is, what is big data? And the answer is pretty simple. It's just tons and tons of data points. Like, we're collecting everything. Anyone here go to the supermarket and use one of those cards so you can get like discounts? They're collecting everything about you. So I've got OnStore on my car. I know they're monitoring me. But we do all this monitoring, and I thought, well, that's just the way we live. We should do something with it. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if like all your buildings had signs on them telling you how much energy they use so that you could decide where to live and where to work, right? I mean, that would be pretty bold. And so, when you look overseas, they do that. So if you go to France and you want to rent an apartment, you get this kind of rating, and they'll let you know based on actual energy bills how much energy your building's using. So it's not just like, oh, look at this stainless steel appliances and this pretty view. It's like, this is going to be your bill. And so some people actually use that to negotiate their rent. So could you imagine if everywhere you went, you knew what was happening with the energy? But then even more than what you know, how do you use it for something? And so, you're all energy guys, you know all of this. Why is energy important? We use a lot of energy for buildings, so is there something we can do to make things better? So we use less energy. Okay, so before I go into what to do with data, let's talk about how hard it is to get data sometimes. Some data is publicly available. I talked about benchmarking. That's not so easy. There's all these challenges. So we all want to get to this goal, right? We want to go and do cool research on energy. But in order to do that, someone's had to have done some sort of analysis. But in order to do that, you need to get some sort of benchmarking. But there's this big hurdle, which is how do you get all of the energy from the data, from the building? So we worked for a couple of years on this project called the Energy Data Accelerator, and it was with the Department of Energy and NREL and ICF and what was then the Energy Efficiency Building Hub, CBEI, Carnegie Mellon, Penn State, yada, yada, yada. But our goal was to figure out how do we streamline the data. Sounds easy, but not so easy. So all of you, you live somewhere, you get that bill every month, and you see how much energy you use. But imagine if I owned a building where all of you worked, and I wanted to benchmark my building. I don't have time to call you and you and you and you and you and ask you all for your bills. That's just way too much time. So can you just give them to me? Well, you still want your privacy. You don't want me to know how much you're using. And so how do we get over that privacy? And then once I get the bills, I don't want paper. Like, can I just get it in Excel and have it automatically go into a program? So sounds simple, but it actually was it took a couple of years to figure out how to do it. And so the goal was we worked with about 20 cities and utility companies across the country. And the goal was to say, we just want to be able to track energy in 20% of commercial buildings. Not all buildings, just 20%. And these were the cities that were involved here. So San Fran, not too far from here, they were involved. And so some of the cities were like leaders, like Chicago and New York and DC were leaders, and they were helping tell the rest of the country, this is how you can streamline it. So from this study, what we were able to find is, one, if you have 5 people in the building, as long as there's 5 or more people, then it's okay for the utility company to give me all the building information, because once it's more than 5, it's anonymized enough that I can't pinpoint how much was you and how much was you and how much was you. So it still is able, you can keep privacy. The other big thing was to transfer the information. No one wants to type it in every month, one at a time. So the codes and electronic ways to be able to just transfer everything from Excel was super, super important. And this may sound simple, but it was a big challenge to match the actual meter with the address. And I don't know if any of you have ever gone to a place and you're looking for the building, but the address is like around the corner, but you really enter from the other side of the building. But sometimes the bill, or the way the energy company reads the bill, is from that way around the corner, which is not the front door, which is not what you actually use and consider the address. So it took some time to actually match the actual building with the actual address. So once those things got done, that was our key finding. So, a couple of $1 million to get these key things, but really important. And in the end, we were able to hit about over 2.5 million customers to follow this process, so that we could basically create a standard so that any new cities that want to do this can join on board. All right. So now what happens, right? You got data. And this is, I feel like, what I do sometimes. I'm sitting there with my students and we're like, what are we going to do? So we did all this work to get all this data. We can Google everything under the sun. But what happens next? Like, what are we supposed to do with it? And so I'm going to talk about 2 things that some students of mine did with data. And we worked on these projects. So this one is not me. This is one of my colleagues and his students. But it was pretty cool, so I included it. We worked with the city of DC to collect their benchmarking data and create a nice tablet tool so they could see how much energy they're using. Because it wasn't just enough to say, oh, like, I don't know what 1 million kilowatt hours is. Like, what is that? And so they could just rank things easily, so that if you don't have a PhD or a master's degree in energy efficiency, you can still be able to just like click, see how much you're using. Everything's weather normalized, so you can compare how much you used to last year or to another building. It's a lot of fun stuff. Seattle, they're using their benchmarking information to help figure out which buildings are using the most energy so that they can then retrofit those buildings. And they're seeing some pretty good improvements in savings of money. So then what did I do? I worked with a rebate company. They manage the rebates for a utility company. And they said, okay, we need to offer these rebates, but how do we figure out what rebates to offer what people? So I said, well, what if we took all the data that's publicly available, right? So this is like the benchmarking information, right, that I just talked about. We've got Google, and we've got what my students call drive-bys, but they meant drive-by in the most innocent way. So my students would literally be like, yeah, we did a drive-by yesterday. And they are talking about just driving by a building. Just to put that out there, in case, you read anything that my students have written and they talk about drive-bys, there's nothing violent whatsoever. So basically what we did is they did these Google drive-bys, sometimes real drive-bys, and just collecting energy data. And then what we wanted to do was we had this question. If we had just anything you can see from outside the building, go into Google Earth, do a view, use the benchmarking data, could you figure out not just how much energy was using, but could you figure out which building attributes were affecting the energy consumption without ever going inside the building? The reason for that is if you could do that, then the utility companies could figure out what rebates to offer without even going to building by building by building. So imagine the millions of dollars it could save them. So, these are some of the buildings that participated in our study, and it was important to use buildings where we actually also had their actual information and we could go visit so that we could validate that we knew what we were doing. So you could do this hypothetical test, but then you needed to check it to make sure it actually worked. All right, so again, we looked at annual data. We looked at some buildings that gave us monthly or interval data, and the building attributes and the city profile, and we looked to see what building attributes could affect energy loads. We started by first looking at their Energy Star scores, again, publicly available data, so we could see which ones, like which buildings had bad scores and which ones had good scores. So we thought, well, that's one way to figure out which buildings need to have some work, but that tells you they are wasting energy, but not why. So let's go ahead, jump up. So then, this is a process called lean analysis, which CMU did not invent, but we've definitely, our students have been using it and doing some strategic data mining to figure out how to really push as much out of lean analysis as possible. And so what it is that, you get your energy bill, and sometimes you may have your monthly data or your interval data at 10, 15 minutes, but you don't know how much was used for heating, how much was cooling, and how much base load. Because if you're going to try to figure things out, then you need to know that. And so what we do is we pretty much, that in the winter, you look at the heating degree days and cooling degree days. So you look at what the temperature was on a particular time of year when the energy was used above a certain area. And then you can figure out, that spike probably came from heating. And then you can do the same thing in the summertime. So you can look at July and say, oh, there was a spike in electricity. So that's probably coming from the air condition running, because you can track it with heating and cooling degree days. You can see. So then once you map all that out, everything that's below becomes your base energy. So it's all the stuff that's used regardless of the temperature. When you do that, sometimes you actually can find that people run the heating and cooling at the same time. So it does happen. Easy answer, don't do it at the same time and it'll save you money, but here nor there. And so we start to look at that and we're able to figure out the inflection points and when we hit our peak loads. So we do all that. Then these are my students doing their, they're collecting the data. So this is, just going to Google Maps and they look. So what can you figure out from Google? Well, you can look for shading if you zoom in. You can estimate your window to wall ratio, because you can, if you find a height of a person or the height of a car, then you can figure out, okay, if the car is this tall, then you can just measure on the screen how tall the building is. Sometimes you can even zoom into bricks, and you can count the bricks on the building and figure out how tall it is or how large the windows are. You can also look and guess, like, I don't see any hinges. That window's not operable. What type of material it is. And then this is, again, when sometimes they did drive-bys to check things out to make sure, which was funny because I swear they would do drive-bys at like 1 or 2 in the morning. And I'm going, why are you driving around the city at 2 in the morning? Go to bed and do it in the morning. They're like, no, this is when we're awake. So I was worried sometimes, like, oh my God, if something happens, I'm in trouble. But it worked out for them. And the part that I didn't mention is I had them in Philadelphia with me for one summer. So these are students that, we're based in Pittsburgh. And I've brought them for 3 months to Philadelphia to work on this project, to a city that they don't know, and they're driving around doing drive-bys at 2 in the morning in Philly. But you can also measure proximity to another building. So that lets you know about shading potential cast on the building. You can look at the color of the roof, so reflectance, orientation, and the shape of the building. So these are just examples of things publicly available. And then we did, a bunch of data mining to see what we could figure out. And this is just one example of something that we already know, but we wanted to see how we could predict these things. And so, one of the things was, we could use monthly data. It didn't even have to be at the interval level, to see that the buildings that didn't have thermostat setbacks, they used definitely a lot more. The ones with thermostat setbacks use less heating energy. And so there was a significant difference with that one. So what I did is have the students just ask questions, and then we'd run the stats on it. And so they'd say, what about buildings with dark glass? Are they behaving different? What about buildings with a white roof versus a black roof? How are they behaving? So they asked those questions. So they started saying, can I tell things by the number of floors? What about how deep the building is? What if the window-to-wall ratio was different on different sides of the building? So they started asking all these questions, and they actually were able to do predictions. So they could start to say, you know what, if a building has certain attributes, they could predict how much energy, not how much, but they could predict whether it was going to be an energy hog or saver. And then I had them look at what type of energy you needed, whether you needed the annual information, monthly, or interval data. And some things are available depending on the city, depending on your relationship with the utility company, of whether you can just get how much it was used in a year versus the month versus every 10, 15 minutes. So this is, just one example of, hey, what happens if we just do drive-bys, Google Earth, and benchmarking? Can we make predictions? And then we gave the recommendations to the rebate manager so that they could start to write rebates based on, decisions without even having to go visit a building. So it helps save them a lot of money. All right, now we're back to the schools. So I was talking in the hallway. New York City does these building assessments. They do these school building assessments. They go in, and an architect or engineer has to identify and rank what's happening in a building. What condition are the roofs? Is the roof? What condition are the windows? What condition is the floor? The law says they have to go and identify it. The law does not say you have to fix the problem if you see it. You just have to identify it. And so I thought, well, that's crappy. First, why? Well, one of the big things is we've got tons of backlog maintenance. So I took this picture. I'm in the classroom, and then I opened the door, and there was no lock on the door. And there's rat poison right there, and these kids are like 5 years old. And I'm going, you don't even have a lock on the cabinet. And then this school, every time it rained a lot, it flooded on the lower floors, but the lower floors are where they had pre-K and kindergarten so that they wouldn't have to walk up the stairs. And this is the only picture I did not take. But there was a school in the Bronx, and there's a couple places like this, where they put the school and it's next to a hazardous material area, and they just give you a chain link fence. And they're like, see, we separated it from the hazardous material because smoke doesn't go through a chain link fence. It's a barrier. And it's just crazy. And so I thought, well, you know what? Maybe all of this absenteeism and all these rates of asthma and, could any of these things be affecting this outcome? When we're dealing with buildings that are 4 times as dense as offices, does any of this have any impact on test scores or health or things like that? So just as a caveat, I'm studying academic health and performance, and we know that it's impacted by a whole web of everything, and the one thing impacts another, and it all has an impact on each other. So I'm looking at just this one little piece of the pie to see what about built environment characteristics and how they have an impact on student academic performance and health. So to do it, hypothesis, if we normalize for race, wealth, sex, and student-teacher ratio, because it can't be a black-white thing, can't be a rich-poor thing, and then we look at these are the various building features, are they going to have an impact on academic performance? And so I looked at, this is a short list, but there were, all of these, a longer list of this, and it was done for 125 schools. And so the data set is 125 schools, 175 different attributes. So everything you could possibly think of, testing each of these 175 things on all 125 schools to look at any outcomes. So my data set has about 8 million entry points. And, I said, okay, let's do some fun data mining. All right, but I'm only going to talk about a couple of solutions because we want to eat, right? So let's just look at a couple of things I found. All right, so building layout. What if we look at the shape of the building? Does that have any impact? So here's why the shape of the building matters. The shape of the building impacts daylight. If your school, if this is a school and your classroom is here, there's no sunlight for you. So you're not getting any. If you have a building shaped like this, you can get sunlight opportunities. Views. What view do you get if you're in here? And frankly, that view is not going to be so great because it's on a curve. Ventilation. Well, there's no cross ventilation happening here. Here you could open the windows, cross ventilation, it feels good. No cross ventilation opportunities. Visual oversight to enhance security. There's whatever your beliefs are about whether teachers should have guns in the classroom, there's a lot of natural oversight that you can do. It's that you're not worried about like the lone gunman or security. But if you think about, if you're standing here and you're a teacher, you don't know what's happening on this side of the building because of sight lines. But something like this, you can easily, the teachers in the classroom have great sight lines of what's happening up and down their hallways. So you can see things. So you just get sort of natural security just by orienting the building a certain way. Learning clusters, you could say, oh, you know what, math is here, English is here, science is here, and form clusters of learning. No learning cluster opportunity. And acoustical separation. Easy to separate acoustics with something like this. Acoustics are not separating here. And that's really important, especially with children, because those who have kids or who have siblings or who have ever babysat, y'all notice kids get distracted, like anything, squirrel, like they just get distracted. And so you want to be able to separate acoustics so that they're actually concentrating on what you want them to concentrate on. So, question, does the shape of the building impact or influence student outcomes? And so, interestingly enough, all those buildings, I call them the finger buildings, the ones that have these kind of wings. It didn't matter, what it was, but this is called like my weird shaped Zaha Hadid type buildings, or these big fat ones. They just did not, they were the worst performers. When you check test scores, I checked absenteeism, all sorts of things. And these kind of buildings just did better. So if you are ever working on a project and you see someone trying to do something like this, no. All right, so what about the building depth? So we talked about building depth when I was looking at how much energy it could save, but what about building depth? And so why does it matter? A building that's less than 39 feet, it's going to be a single loaded corridor. Classroom, hallway, and then there's the walls. So that classroom is just getting tons of ventilation. At this width, you're starting to get double loaded corridors, which means classroom, hallway, classroom. But you could still get light coming through if you have some windows like up above. Once you get to this size, see how they filled in their courtyard? There's no cross ventilation, there's nothing that's happening. So it's affecting the same things as we saw in the other building shape. The layout, the views, ventilation, security, learning clusters, and acoustical separation. So of course, the building depth, the thinner buildings did better in, there we go. So they did better in English, in math, attendance, and suspension rates wasn't statistically significant, but there's definitely a noticeable drop there. So this is literally just looking at the width of the building. Also, if you're thinking about in terms of energy use, these thinner buildings are going to use less electricity because you have sunlight that can naturally light the space, because we use a lot of wasted energy on lighting that could just be really free if you use the window. All right. Also important, manage your window to wall ratio. Not a good idea to put kids in a brick wall with no windows. And a little too much without proper shading also causes problems, because then you get glare and eye strain. So, basically, what buildings did the best? Some of these old buildings from the 20s and 30s and 40s where they had these nice sized windows, just traditional architecture tended to do better than some of the crazy stuff that we think is good. I also checked for age. And the older buildings also, if they were well maintained, did better than some of the newer construction ideas. I'm just leaving all that out. So, again, things that we think are, is natural. Thermal comfort and is a good thing. I went into this one classroom, and they kept the lights out, and it was dark, and they were like, we're trying to keep the room as cool as possible. We don't turn lights on. We don't bring in any extra heat. And I'm like, but it's dark. Well, they'll just have to look closer to the page because it's just too hot. So these are all things that are happening. Good, bad. Green space. So just to recap what a green space is, it is not when you don't have much greenery. It's not completely paved, not a graveyard, not a steep, crazy hill that the kids cannot play on, but you're saying, look at all the green space I have. It's actual space that the kids can play on. So, I don't know if any of you walk. I'm sure you do. This is Davis. Do y'all go into Google Maps to see how far the walk is? So, I said for all of those schools, what's the actual walk to get to not just the front door, but the actual entrance to the closest park, and then adding in some extra time for crossing small streets and more time for crossing bigger streets. The reason for that is some schools do not have playgrounds. Some schools do not have gyms. Sounds crazy, but there are urban schools with no gymnasium, and they say the kids can play in the park. So I said, well, how far is the closest park that these kids are supposed to play in? And so that was the importance of this exercise. So one of the things that I found was elementary schools that were greater than a 20-minute walk to the nearest 5-acre park tended to have 3% higher percentages of those who were overweight or obese. Then the elementary schools where I looked at again for a 1-acre park, and that tended to be at the 5 to 10. It had a range. I say possibly higher suspension rates because I couldn't really prove causality or anything with that, and I had no idea why, but I thought it was really interesting that this distance to the park, I expected it to affect weight. I'm not sure why it's affecting suspension. So, all right, and then post-occupancy evaluations. Another thing that we do is if you don't have all that data, sometimes you can literally just do a survey and ask teachers how they feel so that you can make strategic decisions. We've gone into buildings and used a thermographic camera, and you can see that insulation's missing. So sometimes it's really simple, like, well, if you put insulation in the wall in between the joists, it might be warmer in your classroom. We look at the glare ratios and measure how much glare is coming on the desk as well as the computer screens, and then survey the teachers about how they feel, because we've seen that this connection with glare and with your thermal comfort impacts things. So if you don't have the money to do a full-out study, just a paper survey asking the teachers how they feel and going in and doing the thermographic camera studies and checking out light levels can also help you make good decisions. All right, so this is a question, and I don't have the answer to it. How can we use data to influence socially responsible design? I have my own feelings, but what I want to do is challenge you all to answer that question. Look at all this data that's available. I mean, you can go to Google and get everything. All of the data that I showed you is publicly available. You can write to your congressman or your city sometimes and request access to the data because, you're here in America, and some of it is literally just filling out a form, and they will send you the link to download the data. But so much of this is available, and we're not using it, in my opinion, enough. But we can use it to prove that these things matter. We can use all this data to prove that, wasting electricity or having these bad building designs is affecting your energy consumption. We can use all this data to say, wow, having no insulation on your walls is not only affecting your energy consumption, but it's also making your test scores lower. So instead of just living in the world where we say, I think these things matter, we can use the data, and statistics is fun, to prove that things matter, because to me, the world should live like this. This is Sidwell Friends. My son, I don't think, will be going to Sidwell Friends because it's not in my budget on a faculty salary. But they have a fabulous school, and they're incorporating all these sustainable ideas for the kids. This is a classroom where they're using these nice balls, so it's nice, you know, they're keeping the kids engaged. They have programs like the Bronx Green Machine, where they're using the roof of the building to teach children about agriculture and science, and then also they use the money and the profits from growing the food to learn about business and then bring it back into the community. There's, you know, programs to help kids bike to school so that they're exercising. So, okay, you may be really far from the nearest park, but let's implement a biking program with the community and get some community people to help. So my idea of how can we do this to make socially responsible design is for everyone to get involved. For me to issue challenges, for us all to look at data, for us to find these significant links, and then make, in my opinion, make these things rules. It should be illegal to have windowless classrooms. It should be illegal to have pieces of the wall falling apart in a second grade classroom. It should be illegal to let an architect or engineer design a building that's going to waste energy when we know it. So how do I think we can influence it? By using the data to prove what's good, prove what's bad, and change the way we do business. Thank you. Question. Yes.
I've had experiences with Google APIs, but like using Google too much. To the point where they're like, hey, you need to pay now. Have you guys ever run into that problem where you guys have to sort of sign up for some
No.
sort of like, you know,
I have not had
data too much, or
I have not had that happen. That's interesting, but that's never happened to me.
great. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
You
and
guys
we're
get
like,
free data.
we're just like, I mean, I have my students online all the time, and it's never happened to me. Some of the GIS data, how I was able, even though it's publicly available, one of the GIS textbooks that used one of the authors, Kristen Curlin, teaches at CMU, and she also does a lot of work for, she's done some Department of Defense work and some work for New York City Department of Health. So she was able to introduce me to a lot of people so that I could ask them for the data. Again, it's still publicly available, but you have to know the person to ask. So what helped me with some of it is also that I knew some people who I could ask to ask for me, so that they didn't say like, and why do you want this stuff?
Also, a follow-up question. You guys use like image processing with the image out of the building and then like run it through like a black box sort of thing, or you have students categorize it?
So for this, I actually had them because we weren't, they literally sat there like counting stuff. I mean, it was totally crazy. But now I have a student who's doing a lot more stuff with vision recognition, so that some of this stuff could be coded. But as proof of concept, I literally had students counting bricks.
Yeah.
I have a question. In relation to the finger-shaped building and the eye-shaped building,
Yeah.
is there any correlation, or do you find any correlation between space availability and expense? So maybe it's cheaper to build these eye-shaped buildings, and that's a correlation to why that they're doing worse, or is this cheaper? Do you find
So I didn't check with pricing. That could be an answer, but then what do you consider cheaper? So a lot of times we think about first costs. So it may be cheaper to build the building, but a school's going to be in use for decades, 100 years. Like in New York City, your average school building is like over 7 decades. So when you think about, and some of these schools that I studied were built in the late 1800s and are still being used. So okay, let's think about it. I'm using this building for 100 years. Yes, it was cheaper, but guess what? I now have 100 years of wasted energy, 100 years of depressed test scores. And test scores, there's a small correlation with also taxes. Because you think about it, people do not buy houses in districts where the schools suck if you can help it. So if you have money, you're going to go to the good school district. So you're going to go to the good school district, you now have money, there's more taxes coming into your schools. So it's even more money. So your first cost may be cheaper, but if you look at the longevity of all the costs from, the depressed test scores and the wasted energy, then you've, paid your money back. Another example is one of the schools I worked on. I worked as an architect for a number of years before becoming an academic, but they were spending money in their budget to repaint the walls. And I said, why don't you just fix the roof? And they're like, well, that's from a different budget. That's from like they literally separate like the maintenance budget from the like capital repair building budget. So I'm going, but you do realize that since you have to repaint every year, if you just spend a little bit more money, you could fix everything and then you don't have to, but we think in pockets. So again, yeah, that first pocket may be cheaper, but in the long run, we're really not saving money.
Do any tests where you, like, there's the programs or just changes in behavior in like a school, for example, to improve some of these factors you're studying, and then like do analysis of the performance before and after?
Unfortunately, no, not yet. There's a number of other people who have done some of those kind of studies, and they've gone in and they've looked at it. There was one interesting study where they took kids for a walk in the park, and they found a decrease in the amount of Ritalin that the children needed to take. There was another study where they put kids with window classrooms and some in windowless classrooms, and they could not finish the study because the ones in the windowless classrooms were doing so bad. They were like, we're causing harm during the study. So I haven't done those personally, but I've read there's a number of publications where people have done those kind of studies to look at that. And in Pittsburgh, we have a Green Schools Academy, so one of the things I do is just try to work with schools when they are doing a retrofit to use some of the good ideas, but I'm not tracking the kids' test scores before and after.
I guess the follow-up, could you kind of touch on that a little bit? Which is that, like, when you're doing a test like that, ideally you have some sort of randomized control thing where you're giving some kids an improvement and
Right.
the other kids are not. I would imagine that there would be some like ethical issues.
Yeah.
Trying to pursue that in like a statistically rigorous way.
Mm-hmm. And that becomes the catch, is also because you're dealing with kids. And you don't want to, adults, we can tough it out, but you can't do that to a 5-year-old. So it becomes tricky. So a lot of times that's why your before and after is a little better. But then, the trick will be, is it because it's something new and shiny, or is it because of this thing that you've done? And I like to think it's actually both. But in my opinion, the before and afters work better because you don't want to cause any harm to the children in whatever you're studying. So one of the things I've been doing a lot of talks with like the AIA and our Green Schools, American Institute of Architects, with their educational group, and talking about some of the things we're doing. Trying to publish, I've got a whole bunch of stuff that's like almost done that needs to get out the door. So yes and no, but there's a lot in progress and some things that are done. So one of the things that I haven't been able to get funding for, but I was trying, is to create an indoor environmental quality toolkit for schools. So I had a student just prepare, how could we have some of this stuff just on a website so schools could go in and just get it for free whenever they wanted to. So a student, she worked on it for her master's project. We presented it at Greenbuild, but right now it's only available for some of the local schools in Pittsburgh that work with CMU so that they can get the data. And just by lack of funding, I didn't have time to set it up for it to be super available to everyone and all of that fun stuff. That would be great. But right now it's kind of a local Pittsburgh adventure. Oh, absolutely. So, schools are doing LEED. Some schools are doing CHIPS. Schools are doing a number of different things. And so I think a lot of schools, they do realize these type of things. 'Cause I'm not the only one doing this research. So they are realizing that this is important. I'm just mostly working in Pittsburgh because that's what's local. And our Green Building Alliance, which is the branch of the USGBC. So I'm on the Pittsburgh USGBC Board of Trustees. And so I sit on that board and do things, but it's on a local Pittsburgh level. That I'm not sure. Right now, I know we've just been pushing, because I don't even think we're pushing for it when we have meetings with the Green Schools Academy. We've just been trying to say what are some of the things we want to do in Pittsburgh. And there's a couple of schools where they might do some retrofits, and we just try to make sure they go through the GBA and before they go off and do things. But I'm not sure. And then lately we've just been pushing with the 2030 challenge because, you know, that's big. And so just trying to kind of follow and push schools towards some of those 2030 challenge goals. But I'm not sure. But I will have to check on that to answer your question.
When you were talking about the landlord and release, your slide mentioned that you excluded California in some of your statistics. Can you talk about that a little bit, or what's going on in California?
California's a little tricky. So it's all, and some of this is going to be my opinion of how things worked out, but it was about privacy. So DC, easy. Everything in DC is feds, right? So the feds can just kind of come in and say, we're doing it, deal with it. New York, they are pretty much used to kind of somewhat saying, fine, I'll just deal with it, whatever, no problem. Some of it's your blue state versus red state, but then California is supposed to be really liberal. But because it's so liberal, there's also this huge interest in making sure things are private and keeping your privacy. So while they want it to be available, they also want to keep your privacy. So it's this whole, we're liberal, let us do what we want to be private. Oh, but how do we release the data if everything's private? And so there was a lot of just back and forth with the utilities saying, well, we can't do it because we don't want to violate any privacy. So the government needs to step in and make an ordinance that we could follow so that it's not illegal for us to do this and no one sues us for privacy. So that was some of, in a nutshell, a summary of a 2-year discussion.
Was that, so I think the rules on that changed around 2016. Have you had a different experience since then?
So this project, that was around when the project was ending.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
I think it was end of 2015.
So we presented, so let's see, this is 2017, 2016. Around the end of 2016 is when this project finished, and we started this around like 2013.
Oh, okay.
So,
Too early.
yeah,
The new rules.
exactly. So one of the things, and during that 3 years, a lot of cities changed the rules because there was so much pushing. So Pittsburgh, for example, is not in there, but they were like, oh, I can't do it. But during those 3 years, we were pushing Pittsburgh to say, well, Philly's doing it. You don't want to be left out of the state. And so literally, I think after the best practices came out a year and a half ago, so many more cities have come and done it. So if I were to do a map of how do things look now, it'd be very different. And I like to think it had to do with that you had a few cities say, look, it can work. And PNNL did a study to show how you can still have privacy. So there's just been so many studies and so many front runners doing it, so then other states and cities don't feel uncomfortable. And so there's just been like Pittsburgh just passed their ordinance a little bit ago that they're going to do it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so it's, you know, it's just time. It took some people, no one wanted to be first.
Some leadership.
It took some leadership, some demonstration, and some people doing it first. And some of the big utilities saying, I'm going to take a risk. PECO was one of the biggest utilities that went out there and did it. And the guys at PECO and the the Chicago utilities, they were just the leaders. The guys who ran those programs were amazing. And they would talk to the utility companies all across the country to say, yes, you can do it and still protect privacy. And they literally, like, we ended up giving those guys like a certificate at the White House because they were just so helpful. And it was better coming from them than me. Who wants to hear a professor saying it's going to be okay? But you believe PECO if they come to your utility and say it's okay.
Well, I applaud the work you're doing. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
And especially tying energy data to
Yeah.
And then those are expensive, right? But then on the revenue side, a lot of these schools are driven by ADA, right? So
Yeah.
average daily attendance. So, have you seen a lot of studies where there are those, there's an emphasis on correlating interventions? What I've seen from what you presented is more based on not necessarily interventions, but
Right.
existing
Yeah.
infrastructure, right? Where the parks are, what the shape of the building is, but I think
Right.
if there's an intervention,
What happens?
what happens, and showing that causation to how people, not only energy, people don't really care about energy as much as these potential revenue or performance outcomes. So are you seeing studies like that? Are you engaging in studies using the databases that you have to start looking at interventions?
So I would say I've seen studies, but not enough. There's definitely not, like there should be a ton of them because this is so important, but there's not. So the guys who I think are leading the pack out in California would be your Heshang Mahon people. They had money to study daylighting. Those are the guys everyone goes to for daylighting, and they're out here. A couple of school districts in North Carolina wanted to see how things changed when they built some new schools because they had money coming in. But I'd say for as important as this is, and as many children as there are in America, there should be more studies. But unfortunately, there aren't. But
And
there
if
should
these
be.
Studies, the knock on them is that they haven't been really rigorous. I mean, you feel like they're kind of well respected in the field. They mainly just daylighting
Yeah.
and my sense is that people didn't take them seriously as actually proving whether or not
Well,
lighting would actually impact schools.
and that was one of the reasons for this study that I chose to do it a different way, because a lot of the studies I read were like, we studied these 2 schools and look what happened. We studied these 10 schools and look what happened, and we tested one thing. And people had that same response. But how do you know it was just a fluke or it wasn't rigorous? And so that's why I did this study differently, by saying, well, I need to study over 100 buildings, because if I the idea was if I increase that sample population, then you can't say it's a fluke. But by increasing that sample population, then it meant I couldn't do what they did, which is an intervention, because that's just, money for that. So I think ultimately what we need are more studies, more dollars and grants so that we could do more interventions and push and test so that we have more data and have it be rigorous. But again, all of those are about, federal grants, which are hard, and they're getting harder and harder and harder.
So I guess the following comment, I would encourage us to consider the idea of you have the proper time where we've done all these interventions here in California. What we have done a good job of, I think, in the research community is doing what you've done, which is creating a holistic set of all of the data. Right?
Yeah.
We're looking at, okay, what's the pre and post conditions in terms of the energy infrastructure in the school. We're not looking at test scores, we're not looking at abuse rates, we're not looking at all these other factors which you kind of started to lay out. And so I wonder if you're willing, interested in taking that structure of that, how you set that up,
Yeah.
and working maybe with our researchers.
Oh, absolutely.
To apply that. I think there might be some kind of real benefits.
Oh, absolutely. Would love to.
The other thing I'll just add, and I don't know if you're seeing this, when we've done some studies on whether or not these interventions are working, one of the big challenges has been actually installation. So there's a big variance on performance, energy performance. Well, we actually get the savings we thought we would get in analysis.
Yeah.
And a lot of that we're seeing is going to schools with brand new units that are installed and they're just not even connected.
Oh, absolutely.
For various reasons. So is that
Yeah.
something you're seeing as well?
I mean, you see it in schools and office buildings. You go in, and this is why, retro commissioning becomes so important. And they'll say, oh, this room is cold. And you look, and someone didn't peel, the plastic off the vent. And there's so many things that happen, and people didn't finish. one of the schools that I worked on, they, fixed it, and a few years later, they were fixing it again. And they're like, we don't know why the walls are leaking and cracking so much. We just paid a bunch of money a couple of years ago. You know what the problem was? The contractor had grout over the weep holes. So it was, bad construction. Like, yes, that was great that you repointed the brick, but you also covered up your weep holes so the water couldn't escape. And now that's why you have to redo the whole thing again. But you make an excellent point. It's not just we need to do retrofits, we need to do something new. But if your construction practices are not good and not monitored and then not evaluated and going back and do some retro commissioning once people move in, then you don't know if you're not going to see the savings that you want because it actually wasn't done per what you designed. So we do a lot of post-occupancy evaluations where we go in and then evaluate it once people have moved in to check and see is it operating properly. I'll say a lot. We should be doing more.
I grew up in a county that was kind of strapped for cash on the East Coast, and to accommodate the sheer number of students in my high school, they would bring trailers in, and the brutal truth was that that was the most cost-effective way to put students under the roof. I'm wondering, from your study, what your opinion is on how much of this is bad practices and ill-informed administrators, and how much of this is just we just don't have money in these target districts.
I'm so glad you asked that question because I've been wanting to do a study on the trailer issue. I think it's a fact. People don't have the money. It's a cheap first cost solution. But you're not going to get the same type of acoustics in a trailer as you would a great brick and mortar classroom. Where do they put the trailers? A lot of times they're putting the trailers and then they're taking away space that the kids could use to play. And so now, yes, you have this classroom and you've taken away the space for the kids to play. And remember that that's really important. One school completely was strapped for cash. They put up bookshelves in the cafeteria and just had that as classrooms. So yeah, you're having classrooms, but there's no acoustical separation behind it. So it's a cheap first cost solution. It's the reality of what's happened because so many school districts are strapped for cash. But again, we have to look beyond first cost. And if we look at the fact that what you're doing to the children is going to impact them for years to come, you're not, if you do this to a kid for a couple of years, you're not just doing it for that time. You're having a larger impact on them. I think about my son who's only 9 months old. It's like, oh, what if it's just once a year? Oh my God, that's his whole life. And so, a couple of years for a child is a huge percentage of their life as opposed to an adult. If I go through a bad, crappy year, well, I've got, 40 plus, I've got some 40 good ones, so it's okay. You're a little kid, it affects them, and I think it also, I have no proof of this, so this is just my opinion, but I think it also has an impact on their psyche. This is something I haven't studied. But imagine if you're a kid and you're like in a trailer or you're in one of those rooms and this, stuff is falling in. Do you feel like you can succeed in life? Do you feel like you're going to be one of those people that can go to college and you watch TV and you see all these nice places? Do you feel like this is even something that you could see or have? When I was in New York, as a side story, I ran a teen night program for kids who had various challenges. And I did it through my church, but I remember there's these two foster brothers, and they just looked sad one day, so I was like, do y'all want to come hang out with me after church? And I was going to IKEA. So for those who know, New York and New Jersey are like right next door to each other. So all I did was go through the Holland Tunnel, went to IKEA, and I had these guys like pushing the shopping cart for me, and then I got them meatballs. Those Swedish meatballs are addictive. Then we got stuck in the Holland Tunnel on the way back, and like for an hour in the car. And then I dropped them off at home, and they were like, thank you, Erica, for the vacation. I'm like, what are you talking about? I bought you Swedish meatballs, and you carried my stuff in IKEA. But for them, they never went out of town. They never left that neighborhood. They were living in an interesting housing situation, because I've been in their house, and I saw how many people were in there. And and the school they went to wasn't good. And so they from their psyche, they never saw going to IKEA was a vacation for them. So I think about those kids who are in the trailers or who are seeing these bad things, and I think, what kind of opportunity do they have? How can we expect them to succeed and do well and have the same, I don't know, how do we expect them to perform the same as someone else who had all the opportunities handed to them? So I think it's just about equity. I don't think they're getting an equal share of things. Okay.
Studies done pre and post Cochran School, and we actually got away from the movement to try to address that issue by doing another couple of years later another study, the same way as streamline. But it is a huge issue when you're trying to get enough studies. And I was involved with the solidifying network. For enough time, I'd love to connect you with that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So one of our big efforts is creating a research database where people can search for all the studies related to
Oh, that'd be great.
So yeah, it'd be great to connect.
Thank you. Yes, this is perfect. I appreciate that. I don't know where to go.
A lot of the schools in California are like kind of outdoor schools. Like they're just classroom, and the hallways open outdoor.
Yeah.
What do you think about those schools?
So have not done, so to be honest, haven't done a lot of study in California schools. I know it's just a very different architectural design from New York City. But I think it's great. I think it's nice because you're getting outside. Sometimes in the city, you go in at 8 in the morning, you're not leaving until 3, and, occasionally you have someone cutting school because they want to just get outside. And you're not supposed to go outside because the security guard there is like, you can't leave the building. I went to school in New York and couldn't leave until 3 unless you try to sneak out. But I think it's great that out here you can actually get some fresh air. Of course, there's better weather, so that makes that a lot easier. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity for children to get outside and not just see 4 walls all day, especially when if you're in a classroom that doesn't have a lot of windows. I think it's wonderful.
Thanks for the presentation. So I was really interested in the low-cost methods you use for benchmarking, build disaggregation. Was curious to see on the retrofit side of things that we're starting to see other low-cost options instead of building site audits. Cost of sensors are going down. Is that a trend?
I hope it is. So DOE has a tool, the Asset Score tool, which I think is a really nice free online web-based tool. So you can, and they have 3 different versions: light, I forget the second one, and then full. It says light, something in the middle, and full. But basically, you can go in and just say, I want to try to figure out some information on works better for commercial buildings, not residential. But you can put in like the shape of the building and not the exact shape. Like it's is yours a rectangle or a square? It's a couple of different shapes. So you pick your shape. Everything's a drop-down menu. It asks you questions, and if you don't know the answer, you can it'll make a suggestion based on what's most common for your zip code, and then it gives you recommendations on what you could do to retrofit a building. I think something like that, which was made by DOE and is free, is a nice way to introduce to people, because you may not have the money to hire an auditor. But wouldn't it be cool if you could just use this free online tool and learn, oh wow, I should add insulation. The problem is sometimes the tool will recommend something like triple glazed windows. Who's going to have the money to do that? Yeah. So then you need someone to kind of interpret it for you, like, no, don't do that. Do this other one instead. But I think it's a way to go. It's a start to make it easy and not have to figure out, what am I supposed to do? The other thing with benchmarking is that while it's a great idea, it's also hard sometimes for people to fill out all the forms, and there's a lot of mistakes made. And so New Jersey Institute of Technology has an online tutorial. I don't know if it still exists. I don't know if they have the money to keep the website up, but I had my students do it a couple of years ago, where you could learn how to fill out portfolio manager. And it was a really cool tutorial, and you could do it for free, and you only had to pay if you wanted their certificate to say that you're good at it. And I think I paid for all my research students to do it. Well, I used grant money to pay for it because I wanted them to really do it. But that's another example. So I like to think it's getting more legs, that more and more people are starting to do it. There's more and more investments. Concerned about opportunities for funding, but I think there's still drive with the students to create more things. Like I have a student who's looking at vision detection so that we don't have to do all these things by hand. And so she's looking at like facial recognition software and all sorts of other things that we can use to do it. And her funding's coming from China. They're paying for it. So I think that, more people are starting to be interested in this idea of how can we do more with what's happening and make it available for a regular person who didn't get a master's degree in this stuff. And it's just time and exposure to let people know that these free things exist.
I had another question also, somewhat related to cheap sensors. It seems like a lot of the outcomes that you're looking at might have air quality, both indoor air quality and also the air quality that you guys are exposed to. And I'm wondering if you guys have looked at low-cost air quality sensors if you're doing site visits, you can install those in local schools to do some indoor air quality tests. I was thinking about the soccer field.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things I did, that's a great question. One thing that I did was a couple of years ago, I taught an elective, and because there was so many schools in the city. So again, this is all on local level. But there was a bunch of schools in Pittsburgh that wanted to have an assessment, but they didn't have the money to hire someone to come in and do the full assessment. And so I used a class to teach students how to do the assessment, got all the equipment, and then had the students do the assessments for the schools. So I said to the schools, okay, I know you don't have the money, but if you'll allow some students to do the assessment, I'll teach them how to use all the equipment, and then they'll go in and put in the sensors. That you don't get to keep the sensors. They're going to come in, do the measurements, and they'll do everything, and then they'll bring the sensors back to campus because then we got to use it at another school. So that was one way to do it. It was our low-cost way because it meant the schools didn't have to pay anything. And the students, because there were so many schools, I didn't have money to pay the students, so instead I gave them a grade. So that was like a really low-cost way to do it. And the sensors we use, most of the sensors were bought with grant money and money from other people who hired us to do their buildings. And then once we were done, we used those sensors and then we repurposed them for schools. So it's it was our way of doing it. I think there are definitely some more creative ways. I think there's a professor on campus who's created an air quality thing, and he's trying to keep the price under $100, so it's at $99. So people are inventing things. There's a lot of apps that we're testing to look and see how good they are, but as people do app developments and things you can add to your iPhone, I think there's a ton of opportunities there as well for low-cost sensors in app development.
Was your data set, was that New York City schools or Pittsburgh schools?
So my data set was New York City schools, but my assessments when we go into the building to measure and survey teachers is in Pittsburgh.
Okay. I know in California there's a lot of public air quality monitoring data. I don't know if that's the case in New York where you can get sort of like neighborhood level
Yeah,
evaluation.
I can, but there's so many schools in the neighborhood, so then it was just making the data quirky.
Sure.
One thing I didn't mention for that study is to make sure, because there was so many statistics and I wasn't trained as a statistician, I actually hired a statistician to run the data without me, and then we looked to see if we got the same answers, and we did. So that was like, wow, I did learn something. But it's, it was validated by an outside statistician, and like we were the same on 99% of the findings. Luckily, there's a statistics department on campus, so I can hire them cheaply.
I feel like I need that on all my projects. Interdisciplinary help.
So, being on a college campus definitely keeps prices down. Because you can go to a colleague, go to a professor and be like, hey, can any of your PhD students do this for a class assignment?
One last, I guess we're almost running out of time, but started by talking about your own
Yeah.
We've got a lot of students here that are curious to know what advice you give them as they're here in their first year, graduating. What advice would you give them?
In a career, don't be afraid to speak up and try. Don't, like, if you see something, don't just think this is the way it is, this is just the way it's always done, so this is what must happen. Use your education. UC Davis is a good school, right? Use your education to help inform people who maybe didn't go to a UC Davis or didn't go to college at all, and share your findings. If you're faced with a regulation, don't be afraid to challenge the regulation and see if there's a way around it. So I'm filled with funny stories. I worked on a library project in Queens, and we were picking, so we did the building, but then we were picking the finishes, like the carpet and the fabric for the sofa. And so I picked out what I thought was this really beautiful fabric for the sofas and chairs in the library, and they were like, you can't use that, we have to use something that's vinyl or plasticky. And I was like, that's not going to go with the look. And like, our regulations say that this is what the standard is. So if I just followed the regulation, then they would have had plastic or vinyl sofas. So instead, well, why is that the regulation? Well, it's because after school sometimes, teens do things. And they didn't want vinyl and plastic is easy to clean bodily fluids. I said, well, what if we just put all the furniture near where the librarian is, and then she'll see everything? And they're like, oh, well, then you can change, you don't have to use the standard anymore. So my advice is that sometimes you just have to ask the question. Some regulations are things that are there and you're not going to get around them. And sometimes just talk to people. Like, who knows, because teens make out. Like, well, then don't, get some extra light and put it there, and then they won't do it in public. And, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to just go for it and try. It's a new day. If you've got an idea, push the boundaries. Never stop pushing the boundaries, ever. No matter how long you've been practicing, no matter how old you get, never, never, never stop pushing boundaries. You're welcome. You guys asked great questions. Thank you.